Okay. Okay. Well, it's 11:25, so like I said, people will continue to filter in, and this is being recorded. So if anybody wants to catch up, they'll be able to view this a little later. So my name's Charles Witherspoon. I am a member of ISAC, and I'll be moderating this panel entitled "War in Spiritual and Cyber Dimensions." So we're going to start with Ted Didon from Creighton University. But unfortunately, I don't have a bio for you. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and give us a little bit on your background, and then I think you can just jump right in to your talk titled "The Friend Enemy Distinction Applied to Spiritual Warfare." So the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm Ted Didon. I'm a recent graduate of Georgetown University's PhD program in religious pluralism or theological studies and religious studies. And I also teach at Creighton University, and I generally focus on problems of politics, on problems of religious pluralism, interreligious engagement, things like that. And I've been a participant of this Sophia Institute and now ISAC for about a decade or maybe more, I suppose. It's getting long. The years go fast, right? Everybody knows that. Today, I'm going to be speaking on the friend-enemy distinction applied to spiritual warfare. And you'll see this is a presentation that is kind of a work in the making. It's not a paper, so hopefully what I say makes sense. It's kind of a few thoughts put together into one thing because I'm trying to build the building blocks of something bigger. And I'm curious, the sort of reaction I'd like to get from you is, does what I'm saying make any sense to you? So I will share my screen and we'll get started. Let's see here. Share screen. Okay, can you all see it?
I can see that. Can everyone else see it?
Yes.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, hang on one second. Just put it on a different monitor. It's the amazing thing of having several monitors is you never know where the PowerPoint's going to go. Okay, let's get started. So the spiritual or the friend enemy distinction applied to spiritual warfare. That is the presentation for the day, at least from me. So let's get started. Just talking broadly, setting the tone from our good friend Evagrius of Pontus. I think this kind of sets the tone for what spiritual warfare is, but also how I want to take it in another direction or a further direction than it often is. Certainly not only from me, but I think you'll get the sense for what I'm doing. So here it is. Happy is the monk who thinks himself no better than dirt. Happy is the monk who views the welfare and progress of all men with as much joy as if it were his own. Happy is the monk who considers all men as God, after God. And this is, of course, from the chapters on prayer. And I hope this sets up where we're going, which is to say, this isn't really only about spiritual warfare applied to the heart, applied to the singular person. This is about its application potentially in society itself. So let me just read a few passages from scripture also to orient you into what spiritual warfare even is. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's from Romans. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life. That's from 2 Timothy. And of course, you can understand if that's only applied to, yourself, that makes sense. But if it's applied to the world, it kind of goes a little bit further. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. That's, of course, building off that principle of tzedakah, which is justice for the widow and the orphan, a very basic social concern within Judaism, but then also, of course, Christianity as we go. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Now, I hope at this point you're starting to grasp the distinction that's being drawn out here is this kind of the world versus everything else. The world is bad, the world is fallen, the world is not to be engaged, it's to be fled from. But of course, that's not exactly what we can do in the modern world. And of course, as we know, if we know anything about the tradition, when we're talking about the world, what they're really talking about are the passions, right? The passions, the temptations, these sorts of things that exist in the world. And they manifest themselves in a myriad of ways. Well, how do you get around that? Of course, there's this. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. It's becoming unspotted from worldly things, but also perhaps remaining in the world, because love of this world is death. Okay, so of course, this is a very famous articulation, the 8 evil thoughts, as Evagrius put it, but it's of course developed by John Cassian into the 7 deadly sins later on. But you've got gluttony, lust, avarice, dejection, anger, despondency, vainglory, and pride. Now, the one we're going to focus on is despondency, because I think this is something that's much more relevant to people in our industry or profession or way of life than many others. So when we're talking about spiritual warfare, of course, the classic understanding is how that relates to the person, their soul, and their ability to stave off temptations in their heart, their mind, and from the city. Often this was done by fleeing the city to avoid temptations that exist all over the place, but they exist in a myriad of other ways, such as your quick passing thoughts. Now, the way demons present themselves or temptations present themselves are as noetic entities. They manifest themselves as temptations and thoughts to the person, either in their thoughts or through the city. And these are, of course, intelligent beings, as they're described by Thomas Aquinas, disordered in the rebellion against God. But another way that you can understand them, broadly speaking, is as quick passing thoughts. Now, I'm going to guess, even since I started talking in this lecture, you've had a myriad of thoughts already. You've probably thought about, what you're going to eat for lunch, or if you need to go to the bathroom or whatever else. I mean, there's a million things that we all think about, even as we're talking to each other. These are quick passing thoughts, and often they're negative in their characterization. This is what Muslims called kawatir, and they're manifested by jinn. It's a very similar model that we see in the Eastern tradition of Christianity as we do in Islamic practice. And I'll come back to that in a second. Now, this is contemplative in nature to stave off these temptations. You need prayer, which is fixed by God, as a method to ending these quick passing thoughts and avoiding temptation. Now, of course, not just any prayer is going to work. You need something pure and undefiled. And we're going to have a whole section later in the day on hesychasm and the sort of mystical tradition within the East. And these kinds of basic prayers, these inceptive prayers, these pure prayers, as we might call them, kind of keep us rooted in a sort of pure sense, fixed on battling these temptations or demons. Now, of course, the advent, or the kind of goal, in a sense, is self-awareness. The essence of the 8 evil thoughts is self-aggrandizement or self-love, which is to say magnifying yourself in spite of the sort of order of things, taking the order of things and revaluing or misvaluing yourself as above its standard value. One must see oneself as a bundle of delusions, quick passing thoughts, and self-aggrandizement, and then enter into the fact of spiritual warfare, which is to say, purifying your heart so that you can see God. The self that you think you are in a normal way and in your everyday life is, of course, not really who you are. You need to see yourself as God sees you, which is to say, seeing the good and the bad. If you think you're this bad person, you're probably not all that bad. But simultaneously, if you think you're this very good person, you're probably not nearly as good as you are, or you think you are as well. And you need to kind of root yourself in these basic, pure, inceptive prayers and order your thoughts, kind of staving off the demons. Now, that's kind of a basic understanding of what spiritual warfare is within the Eastern tradition, but you could also say within Catholicism and likely much of Sufism as well, depending on the order that you're talking about. But what I'm going to suggest for the rest of the lecture is that this is not just about self-awareness. It's also about social awareness, because if you'd like to fix the problem with temptation and evil in your mind, you also have to recognize that these sorts of temptations manifest themselves in the city. So how do we actually deal with that? How do we actually deal with the fact that the city is fundamentally disordered? Now, like I said, the classic answer is, of course, flight from the world, but that's not really what we're going to talk about today. Although I do think this really long quote from Evagrius gets to the heart of the specific demon called Acadia. Let me just read this. It's long, but it's worth it. The demon of Acadia, also called the noonday demon, is the one that causes the most trouble of all. He presses his attack upon the monk about the 4th hour and besieges the soul until the 8th hour. First of all, he makes it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and that the day is 50 hours long. Then he constrains the monk to look constantly out the windows, to talk outside of the cell, to gaze carefully at the sun, to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour, to look now this way, that way, to see if one of the brothers might ... and he trails off. Then, too, he instills in the heart of the monk a hatred for the place, a hatred for his very life itself, and a hatred for manual labor. Gives a sort of different resonance to the nobody wants to work anymore line, right? He leads him to reflect that charity has departed from among the brethren, that there is no one to give him encouragement. Should there be someone at this period who happens to offend him in some way or other, this too the demon uses to contribute further to his hatred. This demon drives him along to desire other sites where he can more easily procure life's necessity, more readily find work and make a real success of himself. He goes on to suggest that, after all, it is not the place that is the basis of pleasing the Lord. God is to be adored everywhere. He joins to these reflections the memory of his dear ones and of his former way of life, that is before leaving the world or leaving the city. He depicts life stretching out for a long period of time and brings before the mind's eye the toil of ascetic struggle, and, as the saying has it, leaves no leaf unturned to induce the monk to forsake his cell and drop out of the fight against demons, of course. No other demon follows close upon the hells of this one, but only a state of deep peace and inexpressible joy arise of this struggle. Now, that quote really gets to the heart of the issue, which is to say, you're just distracted. You're tempted by everything in the world. And because you're so tempted and distracted, you kind of look for anything to blame, anything to fix your problems on, whether it's the city or the other people around you or the place you're at or the work you're doing. You're always looking for something else. But Evagrius is telling us, no, it's really got to start in the heart. But theoretically, what we can say is it moves out from the heart into the city. Now, Pope Francis and also other popes lately have actually picked up on this demon of Acadia as a really, really kind of fruitful image to talk about many of these problems we're talking about. In other words, they're building on the Eastern tradition and trying to draw it into the Western tradition in a much more fruitful way. So Pope Francis actually describes Acadia as the greatest enemy of hope itself. And it's the thing, he says, that produces indifference, which he describes as globalized through structures of sin, which is to say, when you're out there in the world and you see, laborers, or you see people who are homeless, or you see people who are hungry, this is basically the way that Acadia manifests itself, in a sense, from your own personal viewpoint, which is to say, you look at them, you might notice them for a second, but you move on with your day. You just keep going. And this is effectively you being so distracted with your own life that you don't see the problems around you. Now, of course, that's even worse when we're talking about things like the global slave trade or human trafficking or anything that is just so far out there. That's far away from our viewpoints, but we should be always aware of these things. We should keep them front of mind. So the question, of course, that I'm asking is, do you see the marginalized, the homeless, the hungry, the slave? What are you going to do about it? Is this sort of spiritual war something that you should take into your own room and your own heart by itself, or should you go out and fight it in the world? Now, there's an interesting guy in the Sufi tradition. He's part of the Qadriya and Naqshbandi orders in the Ottoman Empire in the 17th and 18th century. His name's Abdi al-Ghani al-Nablusi. And he has this theory of spiritual warfare that I think is very, very fruitful for what I'm going to try to draw out, just even for a second, because we don't have that much time. And I also want to throw it open to you guys. But of course, in the Islamic tradition, there's this very, very generally understood distinction between the greater and the lesser jihad. Jihad is, of course, warfare of a holy sort, of a spiritual sort. But the lesser of the two jihads is the one that's most known by Westerners or most known by people in general, which is to say that's the holy war in the world. That's the war against the non-Islamic world, or the sort of unconverted masses, you might say, the outside, the war of the world of war, you might say. But then the greater of the two jihads is, of course, the war against the self, the war against temptation, the war against imperfection from the sort of viewpoint of the believer. But Abdi al-Ghani al-Nablusi, he was a Sufi, and he was living at a time of, say, there was the emergence of the Enlightenment. There's all sorts of new inventions. Globalization had already started. There's all sorts of new cultures and new people entering into the Ottoman Empire. And he was basically looking at this problem and saying, our issue isn't really the world of war out there. There's the problem of sin in the city. The city is definitely manifesting many, many different temptations, and we need to figure out how to apply spiritual warfare to the city we actually live in, to the empire that exists all around us. And he uses siege language for both of these frames of spiritual warfare, the greater and the lesser jihad. So here's what he says about the quick passing thoughts that Evagrius was just describing. If they, that is bad kawatir, quick passing thoughts, pass through one's heart and one rejects them, they will not harm him. But if he accepts them, then they will become related to him and he will be judged by their merit. This is like a situation in which a Muslim and an infidel are imprisoned together in one cell, which is to say they're part of one community, right? There is no out there and in here. It's all one thing. If the infidel speaks his words of unbelief and worships other than God Most High, this will not harm the Muslim because he neither agrees with what is being said nor accepts it from the infidel. Yet he cannot part company from him, which is to say they're not going anywhere, right? This is all here. You have to deal with what actually exists right here. So in other words, the point is this: we are in the same boat, believers and non-believers alike, Christians and non-Christians alike, those who have understood the true God and those who don't. We're all in the same boat. And there's a social obligation for what Abdi al-Ghani al-Nablusi describes as the people of perfection, those who have actually embarked in spiritual warfare in the heart, not just outside of it. So here's the thing I'm just going to say one more time before we kind of go a little further. There's this sense, I sort of actually brought it up during Father McGuckin's speech when he was talking about the Synod of the Wise. I asked the question, are there any fruitful avenues for elite religious actors to sort of build coalitions towards some sort of end wherein spiritual authority or the moral order presses upon temporal politics, onto the world itself? And, one way that I actually think this has been very fruitful are in the joint declarations that have been put out by, say, Pope Francis, Patriarch Bartholomew, Archbishop Justin Welby, amongst many, many others, including Imam El-Tayeb and the Document on Human Fraternity. And these guys, just in 2021, responding to the coronavirus pandemic, they said there's an imperative of cooperation for large social concerns. And this is, of course, started in the heart. So they're sort of already talking about this in a very concrete way. Now, Abdi al-Ghani al-Nablusi, he doesn't specifically call this sort of third way a third jihad, but I think it is a kind of potent image to think of. It's not just war out there in the world. It's not just war there in the heart, but it's war right here in the society that you live in to perfect it, to elevate it. So he describes the people of perfection. That's up here at the top. And the people of perfection are basically those who have already started the spiritual war. This rests on the distinction between friends and enemies of God. Those who engage in spiritual warfare are, of course, the wali. These are the friends of God. And the true friends of God are those engaged in the spiritual fight, which is to say they've become people committed to their own perfection in sight or in light of the perfect God. The people of perfection are concerned primarily with two things, he says: personal and social perfection. It's about purifying your heart and also the world. These are people who are inside and against the empire. Now, he doesn't mean this specifically as like, okay, we're against the Ottoman Empire or the Roman Empire. It doesn't matter what empire it is. It's against temporal power, which has been corrupted. So spiritual authority, spiritual or moral authority has to come in, step in, and kind of designate what ought to be done. So unlike the lesser jihad, the potential third jihad concerns the imperfect state of people and society inside the Muslim world or the empire specifically. But I really think you can just apply this to anyone, right? Anyone who believes in true moral authority and the one true God. Now, of course, when we're talking about these mystics, these spiritual types, and maybe you see yourself as one of them, if you flee from the world, it's pretty easy to sort of be unspotted from temptation in the city. But those who don't flee from the world and don't go, run off to the caves or the desert or the forest or whatever, you have to sort of stay in the city. And that means you're part of the masses. Now, he described this tension very vividly. He talks about it as being a solitary in the crowd. And the people of perfection all know this difference, but they do not flee anyway. They stay inside as a solitary within the crowd, focused on imperfection where it exists. And it exists really everywhere, including in the orders like the Naqshbandi order that he was a part of. It's something that just constantly exists. It's omnipresent. You have to continually raise it up as best as you can. And the thing that you have to worry about is, of course, despondency. This gets very difficult. So when you're despondent as a spiritual master, you become sort of dejected and hopeless, and you don't even think such an elevation of society is possible. So the ideal here is, of course, raising, from his perspective, raising the caliphate towards perfection, but you can really just say sort of humanity as such. So the third jihad is focused on the state of perfection of the friend group. But the question really is, who are the enemies, right? If the friend group that I'm trying to draw out maybe is a little bit bigger, the question is, who really are the people of God? Who are the enemies then? Now, the primary temptation, like I just said a second ago, for the friend of God, therefore, is spiritual despondency. It's basically seeing this as a hopeless paradigm, that you can't really go beyond these distinctions of identity, that you can't really address the problem of imperfection or temptation in the city. So, well, what do? You basically have to just stay in the fight. You have to resist the sort of temptation to flee the city, to flee the world. So the question I have before we continue is, can Christians figure out a possible route for blending the perfection or purification of the heart with the potential for peace in the world? As in, is it just about apatheia in the heart, about the passions, or is it really also about peace, as Father McGuckin was talking about it? Can war become abolished in a technical sense? Is that even a possibility? And in this struggle, what really are the sides? So when we're talking about friend and enemy, this is just such a classic distinction. And of course, it's made famous in the modern sense by Carl Schmitt, but it goes back all the way to the very beginning of these traditions. Here's what Aquinas and Aristotle say about friendship. There are three basic levels. One is the friend of pleasure. One is the friend of utility, and the friend of virtue. And I think you could probably imagine the hierarchy. The friend of pleasure is the person, you go out to drinks with, you have some fun with. They're a friend that you engage in carnal activities with, doesn't matter what sort. The friend of utility, though, is in between. It's a little bit higher than the friend of pleasure and a little bit lower than the friend of virtue. But this friend of utility, I think, is actually quite a good category for what I'm about to sort of draw out in a second. And you can think of this in terms of alliances. You can think of this in terms of, friends with exchange value, someone who has a value to in terms of their use. But if you are a person of perfection, a person who's engaged in the spiritual fight, you ought to be, in theory, you ought to be drawing all of these people towards virtue, which is, of course, a relationship with the true God. Now, a friend of virtue in this classic sense is, of course, someone who has this relationship with God and you desire the good for. So it's someone who has to have that in the first place. Now, when it comes to enemies, it's a little bit different. Here's two. It's a basic distinction within it, and it comes from Plato, but of course, it's drawn out by so many others. But of course, the main one is Plato. So inimicus, which means a foe, it's civil strife. It's internal to your society. And this is an agonism. And I'm going to talk about agonisms and antagonisms in just a second. Then there's the other one. This is the one we all know. Hostis, an enemy, a true enemy, someone who's at war with you, someone who's an external threat, someone who's on the outside of your in-group, whether they're all friends or not. And that's an antagonism. Here's what Plato says. It seems to me that as we have two names, war and civil war, so there are two things, and the names apply to two kinds of disagreement arising in them. The two things I'm referring to are what is in one's own and akin on the one hand, and what's foreign and strange on the other. The name civil war applies to hostilities with one's own, while war applies to hostilities with strangers. But of course, the question that I'm kind of underlying here is, who really is your enemy? Who really is the stranger? When we're thinking about larger categories like the people of God or humanity as such, it starts to expand the possibility of friendship pertaining to virtue. Now, the friend-enemy distinction as an agonism is something that, I didn't come up with this. This has been actually articulated for at least 150 years. And one of the famous people that did it was even before Carl Schmitt was talking about it. There's a guy named Luigi Sturzo, who was an Italian Catholic. He was talking about how you can basically transform this dynamic into something a little bit more coherent and internal, where you don't have to see it as a sort of ultimate clash. So Warfare, internal and external, is of course a very real distinction. So is the friend and enemy, right? We know who our enemies are, at least theoretically. But often it seems as if the distinction between the spiritual war and, say, the holy war, the war against the world, is used at the expense of one versus the other. You either do one or the other and not both at the same time. But hopefully, like I just showed you, Abdi Al-Ghani al-Nablusi, just as one guy, I'm sure there are many, many other guys who have said something very similar, basically see this as a blend. There's something that is blended in the world, and you can apply this sort of spiritual fight to the actual world you're in. In no way is this exclusive to Islam, and is practically speaking the way in which many Christians already view it. Like I just said, I sort of think that, when you look at some of these joint declarations, this is already more or less present within Pope Francis, Patriarch Bartholomew, and many others. This is just giving language to it. Now, virtue being the sort of end point, the goal, in a sense, is an issue of the common good. Now, the classic way that we understand this is, of course, that my virtue depends on your virtue, and our virtue altogether builds up virtue in the city, kind of building up the city of God. That is the common good. Now, if I don't kind of present or provide conditions for virtue to actually exist in the city, how can I expect you to be a virtuous person? And if you're not a virtuous person, likely I won't be either. It's basically codependent. We depend on each other in this sort of sense. So agonism versus antagonism. This is a really important point in a sort of direct way, which is to say an antagonism treats these distinctions or these opposites as annihilative, which is to say a friend and enemy have to be in sort of mortal combat against each other. One has to take out the other. But if you put them in an agonism is something that maintains the whole. It basically keeps the parts within the whole, but recognizes tension, rivalry, even just general conflict. It basically says, yes, these two things, they will exist in conflict, rivalry, but they don't have to exist literally to annihilate the other. This was what Hugh Nicholson used as a framework to engage with comparative theology or interreligious engagement. It was to say that, Islam and Christianity, these are just two examples. They are in rivalry with each other very often, but they don't have to exist in a sort of paradigm wherein one has to eclipse or take out the other. But I think realistically speaking, you can apply this exact same logic to even internal discourse within religions, right? If we're thinking Catholics and Orthodox, or we're thinking internal tensions within the Orthodox tradition, it doesn't really matter. Keeping an agonism as present for the sort of framework you've got with friends and enemies will really help understand the prospect of peace. So an antagonism applies an annihilation, and an agonism does not, or at least might not. Warfare, both internal and external, meaning the spiritual war or the holy war, of course, implies annihilation in its ultimate sense, right? You want to destroy the demons, you want them to go away, but realistically speaking, the way that that manifests in the world is perhaps not so annihilative. But the question with respect to friends and enemies is really, again, who is my friend and who is my enemy? Are those with different visions of the good really my enemy? Are those who see perfection differently from me ones I can build an alliance of utility with? Well, perhaps we can, even across hostile boundaries. Even if we really believe very, very different things, we can look at second order issues like citizenship or environment or anything like this, right? We can look at that and say, well, perhaps we can build an alliance for that end, and we can apply the good fight to those sorts of concerns. Can we find friendship for both internal warfare and warfare against social perfections in societies shared by multiple religious identities? I would say absolutely we can. And we definitely see this with those joint declarations I was talking about. I mean, I should have probably added a little bit more on that, which is to say, it's clear that at an elite level, the elite actors definitely understand this prospect, which is to say, you can't exist in this paradigm of holy war. But at a sort of lay level, a level of dealing with the laity, the common people, you often do see this sort of tribalistic or fundamentalistic antagonism, which really kind of sets these groups of people at odds with each other when they should be finding common ground and building a better world. So seeing agonistic others as fraternal, though often in rivalry, with an aim of finding common ground for perfected outcomes, so think social belonging, union with God, political programs such as ecological stewardship or world peace, really ought to be an aspect of spiritual warfare. This is not just something applied to the world, but it's something applied to our heart. Because again, my virtue depends on your virtue. I will never become a virtuous person in the city if we don't all work on this all together. So war against the passions, imperfections, and evil itself, or even war against war itself, has to become a sort of end with respect to spiritual warfare. Obviously, sharing a tradition or identity does not imply true friendship or even alliance. Like we talked about, there are many tensions between religions, between or inside of traditions, even inside of churches, right? We see this all of the time. People do not have the same sense of the good, but we can at least find a sense of friendship vis-a-vis utility, right? This is an alliance. It's something that we see and we find common ground from, even if we have a different sense of what is virtuous. Shared identity and tradition does not imply friendship with God, nor does it imply greater virtue by any measure. We make friendships of virtue and alliances of utility across many boundaries in the world. And social awareness, not just self-awareness, like I was talking about in the beginning, is another key element of spiritual warfare, and it is drawn out, I think, through the friend-enemy distinction. It's made very apparent in that way. The Christian tradition has much to say on this matter. What are, and this is a question I'm throwing open to you guys, what are some good resources for developing this form of thought? Are there any great masters, great thinkers that really should be at the forefront of drawing out this kind of synthetic approach to spiritual or holy war, or let's just say war in the world versus war against the sort of temptations in the heart? And Acadia, resulting in spiritual despondency, leads us to resign ourselves, our in-groups, are they even actually our friends, and puts us on a path of failure to elevate the social group aimed at perfection, which I'm trying to say really should be the people of God as such, not just one group or another, but all of the human race. Because as it says, God desires to save all people as a people, right? Not just as Christians, not just as Jews, not just as Americans or anything like that, just all people as a people. So as a lure, this is just to kind of end and wrap up to throw open for discussion. As a lure for this sort of thing, I really do think peace is the great kind of symbol. It is the symbol that ultimately contains all the others with respect to war, because it is its fundamental opposite. Peace, external in the world peace, the sort of thing that Father McGuckin was talking about with a synod of the wise, which is such a great phrase, but also apatheia, which is to say internal dispassionlessness, which is to say getting rid of the temptations, focusing on perfection itself. These things should be a lure for both aspects of spiritual war, which I think really can be blended together as one thing. So I'm just going to end one more time with this, and I hope maybe you'll see this quote. This is a very famous quote from Evagrius, maybe in a new light, because I sort of think he got it, whether it's apparent or not. Happy is the monk who thinks himself no better than dirt. Happy is the monk who views the welfare and progress of all men with as much joy as if it were his own. Happy is the monk who considers all men as God after God. Okay, let's see here. How do I end the screen sharing?
I believe that would be, it should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you originally shared.
Yeah, it's not. Hang on.
Huh, interesting.
No, I mean, it's on my end. I've just got to resize the window. It's got you guys in a block right here. Where can I find the... It's so weird. Is there any way you can like kick me off?
Maybe. Let's see what I can do. In the meantime, thank you for the wonderful talk. Very expansive. I'm sure everyone has a lot to think about. So I would like to invite people to ask questions, share any concerns or any input. You are welcome to drop it in the chat, but we're a smaller group than we were originally this morning. 90 people in the room. We're only 15. So if you just want to unmute,
Oh, here it is.
there we go. Multiple screens will do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as I said, you're welcome to talk in the chat. I see Paul wrote Acedia is a big one for me. Cynicism, I'm afraid I have to leave for something else. Thanks for the talk. All right. All right. So yeah, if anybody would just like to unmute and ask a question to talk in the chat. We have, I think, a
Yeah.
little extra time for Ted right now because we're still missing, I believe, our other two speakers.
Oh, really?
They must have
Okay.
gotten they're in different time zones. I believe one's in Georgia and the other speaker is in Rome.
Yeah, Jen is in Rome.
Ben's in Rome and Alicia is in Tbilisi, Georgia.
Yeah, well, I'm in Italy too, so that shouldn't be an
Are you
excuse.
really?
No, I'm not
Why are
kidding.
you there?
Yeah. I'm visiting my mom. She lives here.
Oh, wow, lucky her. I was just gonna say what Paul just said. He translates this as cynicism. This is one reason I really like Acadia a lot as a term because it translates to several different things that I think are kind of at the heart of many of the issues we deal with personally and socially. And cynicism is, of course, a good one. But I really like Father Gabriel Bonga. He wrote basically that it's boredom, right? I mean, boredom. If you think about that, it's just being totally kind of disinterested in things. And of course, the ultimate thing being your spiritual connection with God, union with God. But it could be as much as, I'm disinterested in the fact there are homeless people or there are slaves or anything like this.
Mhm.
I suppose, like, maybe I'm interested in any kind of distinction you might want to draw between boredom and despair, because it seems like those are kind of related concepts in this. When you're talking about, one's experience of the city and one's experience of like the overwhelming injustices that you bear witness to when you're in a city, or um, you don't really get overwhelmed with boredom. You get overwhelmed with how impotent you might feel, how how what you're retreating from is when you go to the country and you try to sort of get yourself right with God and retreat to the cave like in a scene or something.
Yeah.
What you're actually what's going on there is you're feeling like defeated and scared and overwhelmed by tragedy. I don't know if boredom is really the way to go about it. I suppose boredom is the coping mechanism that people in the city adopt for themselves if they choose to remain in the city.
Yeah.
Um,
I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely see that too. It's basically it's like the coping mechanism, or even sometimes the first step if you've been, inoculated by it your whole life. Because, I mean, Father Pratt, you live in DC. I live there too. And Will, you've lived and many of you actually have lived in New York. I have too. You see it literally everywhere, right? It is impossible not to see these things. But for some people who've kind of only ever lived in these environments, it's not even just that you feel impotent, it's that you just don't notice. You just kind of think it's normal. It has been so normalized that you are fundamentally indifferent. And, that's why, again, this word, Acadia, it just sort of means a whole package of things that you can say. But cynicism, boredom, dejection, hopelessness, despondency, any of these things basically amount to the sort of disconnection with reality. And the reality is that God has called you to build the common good and also purify your heart, right? So in other words, it doesn't really matter which word you're using. It's just a disconnection, a severance from your true purpose. Yeah, it's actually interesting leaving DC and New York and now living in Omaha, which is not that small of a city. It seems small to people who live in, bigger cities, but it's 1 million people. You can see all the same stuff that you see everywhere. It's just not everywhere, if that makes sense. You can see anything in these places, but you really can be kind of isolated from homelessness and poverty. You can get around without seeing these things quite so clearly. And that in itself makes me think, maybe boredom presents itself in an entirely new way, which is to say it becomes sort of remote and it becomes sort of fantastic. It's not really a real thing if you don't want it to be a real thing. And that's just a new way I'm experiencing it here that I've never really experienced before.
All right. I see, Julia, you have your hand raised.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Ted, for the wonderful presentation. It's so heartening. I've learned so much from your presentation. So I'm still trying to formulate my thought, but I really wanted to throw it out. I mean, I'm sure the wise minds of all of you can, even if I might be unable to articulate as well as I want to, but I'll try. So my question, the starting point of my question is around the tension between the friendship utility and the virtuous friendship. I find it so what I meant by tension is, so you put it in hierarchical order, right? Like my understanding is like virtuous is the, I guess, supposedly or by potential, the deepest possible human friendship or authentic friendship as suggested by Aquinas, I believe. Then I find it interesting, you made a point around utility friendship can be actually a form we don't have to negate it, we can utilize it because it holds so much potential. Also, that speaks to me, we don't have to try to build like a virtuous friendship with every single neighbor, right? So that's like a too high ideal, maybe it takes a selection, etc., etc. But then, I mean, your talk, so my understanding is this I guess solidarity or our and another point thread of your talk is my virtue is based on your virtues. It's like our as humanity, our virtues are intertwining. It's like then so I see a tension between those two because I think the potential hindrance for virtuous friendship is human beings, we go for utility because that's we just do that. So in order to really focus or be sincere about building virtues, we need to go for virtuous friendship. So, but now in order to, virtuous friendship might be too difficult to build or I don't know, or too few candidates are for that, then we have to go for utility. Then by doing that, we are kind of basically hindering ourselves. I mean, we only have this 24 hours, 7 days a week, right? But
Right.
not the practicality of the time, but also the mindset. I think that's like actually, I wonder whether there's a potential, I guess, harmfulness contained in this if we try to utilize utility or we try to think about it that way. But does it remove us from a potential greater effort towards virtuous friendship, which is actually the root of here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's one of the reasons why I use the word alliance and common ground later, is because I think that, yes, utility, when you kind of generically understand it, that's just not something that we should really redeem. When you think about basically utility reduced down to exchange value, like what you get from them, that's not really worth kind of pursuing as an act of virtue. But I think you can definitely think of utility in another way, which is to say, or I should say exchange value in another way, which is to say more of a theology of gift, which is to say you're giving something and you're getting something, receiving something, and gift is not a bad thing, even if there is an exchange happening. Like the way that I explain this to my students is think about a friend of utility in two ways. One, you've got the friend, maybe because they're usually 18, so they've seen this in high school, which is to say there's that kid who has the really nice house, that they have the pool, they have the big screen TV, they're the ones that all the kids want to have parties at, but maybe they don't really like that kid that much, right? But there's this friendship of utility, there's this exchange value here where that kid gets included in the social belonging, but he provides the gift, or I should say provides the sort of product of having the nice house and the nice things. That's a lower tier of a friend of utility than I'm really talking about. But think of another one, which is to say the friendship of utility vis-a-vis us as professors and students, right? There is an exchange happening here. They have to do the work, and from that, they will get a good grade if they do well on those things. There is an exchange value here, but the value of having a teacher who sees the larger picture of virtue is that the point of these assignments, right? It's not just to do some work and exchange these assignments for some grade. It's to elevate them. It's to draw them into the tradition and make them better writers and thinkers, and hopefully develop a longer lasting relationship with ultimate things. So that's the thing that I'm sort of talking about, is that it's not just rooted in this pure exchange, but perhaps you can think of utility in another sense, which is closer to the act of giving and receiving, or just theology of gift, right? The gift even of the incarnation in itself. So that's kind of what I'm talking about in a sense. I just didn't really draw that out because it's, there's only so much time to talk about that. But hopefully that makes a little more sense, which is to say you don't have to think specifically about exchange value in a purely transactional sense, even if a transaction is taking place.
Thank you very much. It sounds to me like if utility is utilized for the sake of virtuous development, that would be,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like, of course, anyone who's engaged in this at our level, right, where we're talking about things theologically and kind of ultimately, of course, if you don't have utility as the final, or sorry, virtue as the final lure, then, what are you really even talking about here, right? It's not merely about getting nukes off the table. It's about getting nukes off the table because it could end in such a big catastrophe for the human race, right? That's the point. It's not just about saving the owls from, bad ecological practices. It's about saving them because that's bad in itself, right? It has to have the sense of goodness and badness, of virtue and vice.
Okay.
Yeah, Alex.
I see you have your hand up, and Alice, you also wrote in the chat. I'll just read that, and then you can proceed. But I'm working with homeless every day in collaboration with them and other providers, establishing oneself as less that the one encountered is the first step. So Alice, if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead.
Okay, my question is, in the issue of utility, which is, the exchange of different services, certainly where I live, has to be done in the context of relationship.
Mhm.
And that's the missing element for me, is contexting the work of not just seeking virtue, but seeking relationship. A relationship established by trust and faith, and in which many mistakes will be made, many errors will be committed. There is no perfect path. But I wonder if you could comment briefly or fully on the issue of tying the destination of virtue to relationship.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wish I had a more concrete answer for you. But the first thing that comes to mind is, one thing I talk about when we talk about justice in my Intro to Christianity classes, there's this broad kind of secular understanding of social justice, right? Which is to say that justice is distributing itself a sort of to its proper end in a social context. But this is a sort of lesser form of divine justice. And justice, the way that I understand it fundamentally, is it's a right relationship to the good itself, which means it's deeply relational in its sort of general classification. And so relationality is like almost a presupposed aspect of what I'm talking about. I just didn't draw it out. It's to say that if you're not relational, fundamentally, you've kind of severed yourself from the deeper connections that we're talking about, ultimately with friends versus enemies. Because I mean, one of the main points that I'm really trying to draw out is that you can't be isolated, right? Yes, okay, fine. I'm glad that the monks got to go out, live in the desert, but we are not going to live like that right now.
Great. So I'm sorry to cut it short. I know the conversation is really just getting started, but I see Alicia is here. That's how you pronounce your name, Mr. Bowman. So we have half hour left in our session, and I'd love to give her the opportunity to start a presentation. So Ted, thank you very much for that. As always, wish we always had more time. That's how these conferences go, unfortunately. But thank you again. And Alicia, I see you're unmuted. I don't have your bio in front of me, but if you'd like to give yourself a brief introduction, a little bit about just you, your bio, and then jump into your presentation.
Yeah, greetings from Rome. I am a teacher Tbilisi in Georgia, and also in many pontifical Athens University in Rome. I teach in spirituality. I have earned PhD at the Gregoriana in theology, spiritual theology. I will share my presentation. Right. Thank you. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, estimated participants, allow me to begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude for the honor of being to be able to take part in this conference. This speech is integrated into the line of reflection, welfare, violence, and peace. The aim will be to explore the spiritual experience of suffering in an extraordinary 20th century writer who eloquently described the impact of the Russian Revolution on her life. This is Yulia de Borisov, a Russian-born writer who took refuge in England. Will be the subject of this discussion. Born in 1893 in St. Petersburg, Yulia suffered imprisonment during Stalin's roundup in 1930. Her husband, Nikolai, a diplomat and anti-Bolshevik, was arrested before her and disappeared forever. After her husband's death, Yulia left Russia in 1934 and found refuge in England. It was here, from her confinement, that she wrote her biography, The Woman Who Could Not Die. The first testimony, skillfully articulated with the narrative expertise of Soviet horrors, penned by a Christian woman. The text is potent as it stands as a manual of resistance, narrating a struggle waged against an infinitely superior, overwhelming force. Tempted by the life full for Christ, she nevertheless chose the path to the west. From England, Yulia returned to the Orthodox tradition. She wrote about Seraphim Sarov, translated the spiritual letters of St. Macarius of Optina, and ultimately penned Creative Suffering 1940, a breviary that reconciliated atrocity with the inner order. After 7 years of imprisonment in the Soviet Union Gulag concentration camps, she embraced and summarized her experience in the pamphlet Creative Suffering. During this time, she endured abuse and violence. Her life was marked by suffering, but she managed to reinterpret pain according to her faith, drawing from its profound lessons that she has bequeathed to us. Yulia de Borisov, writing from London about her experience of isolation and exile in the dark post-Reliance days, described how the Russian people, who she considered herself a part, had learned to respond positively to suffering. The fundamental premise is the suffering can be used creatively, leveraging the strain of Christ's victory over death. Cruelty is symptomatic of a deeply rooted evil that surpasses human understanding. First, her time in prison allowed her to delve into the very root of evil, which for every Christian were defeated on the cross. Sete questions. Oh, what does the Bible say about God and the mystery of human suffering? This is a question of physical pain, of illness and death relate to the bolder issue concerning human finitude. Man constantly faces the horizon of death. He is a sein zum Tode, like Heidegger said. On such a profound problem, suffering humanity as sought answers not only in philosophical speculation, but also in religious belief. The problem of the meaning of suffering being inherently personal and concrete, yet involving all of humanity, requires a reflection that encompasses every level of reality. It calls for a reflection of the most human dimension of this problem, embracing each individual's ability to consciously integrate into their existential worldview. This endeavor was magnificently undertaken in the past century by authors belonging to various religions and denominations, such as Wiesel, Bonhoeffer, Moltmann, and others. The most famous biblical reference to the reality of innocent suffering is found in the book of Job. This text has been the subject of commentary by great thinkers of the church, from Augustine and Gregory the Great to Elie Wiesel, who survived the Holocaust. This book allows us to glimpse, on one hand, the silence of God, and on the other, is a merciful care for suffering poor who undergo a process of inner transformation due to their pain. This entails moving from resistance to supplication, acceptance, making choice, and ultimately sharing and experiencing this journey together. This author urges us to perceive in a catastrophic events the positive resonance of the suffering endured by others, proposing a transformative solution to begin that embodies the incessant pursuit of holiness akin to that of Christ on the cross and the great patriarchs and prophets of the Old Testament. We pass creative suffering of Julia. In 1932, Julia de Bersover, a highly inconvenient and politically exposed woman, Russian woman, was imprisoned as the result. She was a young aristocratic lady from a noble family in Tsarist Russia and spent her early years in St. Petersburg. In 1914, at the onset of the Great War, she returned from her European trip to serve as a voluntary nurse. In the 1920, she married Nikolai de Bersover, a Russian diplomat. Her marriage to a diplomat drew the attention of the political police. resulting in their imprisonment. Her personal suffering was first recorded on paper in the 1938 in her autobiography, The Woman Who Could Not Die. Having sought refuge in England since 1934, she provided a powerful account of her captivity in Soviet Union camps, along with a careful analysis of the various psychological and spiritual states she experienced during her painful ordeal. In this text, Julia recounted the illness she contracted and her fear for her life. From the exile in the 1929 to Nikolai's arrest in February 1992, followed by her own arrest 6 days later. After being realized from the concentration camp, she decided to seek refuge in Great Britain. It was during this phase of her life, alone, without assistance or shelter, with the confirmation of Nikolai's execution, that she began her original elaboration of the concept of creative suffering. This led her to write Creative Suffering in 1940, a theological interpretation for her personal experience in the light of Eastern mystical churches. She was guided by the idea that, like the foolishness for Christ, she has been called to participate in the miseries of life. In the autobiography, Julia placed the emphasis on the aid she received from meditating on the gospel. It was the word of joy and peace be with you that surfaced forcefully in her prison cell, offering her an avenue of escape from despair. Julia mustered the courage to address her 5 armed jailers, saying to them that I could. What did this serene gaze of perfect understanding reveal to her? In Creative Suffering, being a sharp-eyed and observant observer, Julia described how a victim could survive the cruelty of their tormentors through an extraordinary clear effort of perception of both reality and oneself. This effort, incidentally and inevitably, is capable to guarantee the victim of abuse a kind of inner serenity. Julia was certain that even this inner peace could be shattered, particularly when the pressure from the captor is of a psychological nature. What Julia did was to analyze the very idea of suffering, not so much from the perspective of the isolated victim, but from that of the martyr of suffering. The martyr embedded in the mystical tradition of the church. She wondered if the belongingness of the tortured ones to the church could alter the perception of suffering itself. That is, if recognizing oneself as a part of the mystical body of the church, of Christ and the Church could exchange the balance between the tortured and the torturated. Supporting this hypothesis, Julia found illustrious examples from the Orthodox mystical tradition, such as that Mother Theodosia and the other nuns encountered by Seraphim of Sarov in the lumber camps in the forest. Although the nuns were prohibited from singing hymns and litanies out loud, they constantly prayed to Christ, and Mother Theodosia herself continued to watch over the tiny heathen on her deathbed. Julia learned a great deal from those known about self-discipline. She knew she was part of the mystical body of Christ, and as Mother Teresa has suggested, Julia realized that this view of suffering as an essential part of communion with Christ was typically Orthodox, but at the same time, it should not be limited to the Russian Christians alone. On the contrary, she believed that spreading this constructive perspective on pain could help every Christian bear the burden of personal suffering. A reference to the fools for Christ finds resonance in the Western mystical tradition as well in the writing of Julian of Norwich, and not just in the Gospels. Julian's positive view of suffering, which through her contemplation of her own bewilderment in the face of the hell that separated humanity from God, led her to believe that if everything was brought into being and accomplished by him, then even she could be seen as a something being, alleging not only with Julia's thinking, but with the entire Orthodox mysticism. This universality of value is explicitly expressed in the creative suffering, where Julia explains how accepting the prescription of her communion with the saints allowed her to overcome the sufferings of imprisonment and experiences a state of peace. However, the merit of this outcome does not solely lie in a mental state, but directly stems from the passion of Christ on the cross, which in turn depends on God's merciful love. Realizing that she stood beneath the cross implied belonging to the community of all those to whom God has granted knowledge of his peace, even in the midst of pain. However, Julia focused specifically on redemption because it assisted her in redeeming the act of sadism and cruelty that she herself as a victim has endured. This attention to redemption also had deep roots in the Orthodox mystical thought. The life of Seraphim Tsarov is once again an emblematic example. In one of the episodes from his biography, the saint had encountered in the forest a reanimated creature, a ransomed tree, a towering black spruce illuminated from within. An echo, so to speak, of his transfiguration, a sign of the new creation that was gloriously breaking into this path. Julia realized that the peace she has attained was of a transcendent origin and not psychological. She knew that, I quote, Julia firmly believed that the path towards transcendence leads directly to the limits of the human existence. Educated through the active participation that one can overcome difficulties, not through the resistance or evasion. The effort to transcend evil through sheer force inevitably led to further evils, which is why her hermeneutical essence of creative suffering is undoubtedly found in participation. What does ascertain what suffering is a creative entail? While this author illustrated her concept of a participation through imagery drawn from the Russian and English literature, the broader significance of this notion can be discerned. The concept of active participation in suffering or in the evil of the other involves integrating both the evil and the wrongdoer into a wider context, the context of God's plan and one's own state of sanctification. Participation entailed a loving sympathy towards one's jailer based on the behalf that where, I quote, where evil is as its most intense, there too must be the greatest good. To us, it is not even an hypothesis, it is axiomatic. End of quotation. The author is therefore particularly sensitive to the social aspect of suffering. The Berceau assures us that such a sympathy is an act of redemption for the one who suffers and for all others. Through loving participation, suffering can be created in the sense of I quote, an impersonal enrichment and universal good, a part of the redemptive work of Christ in this mystical body. Participation is perhaps the only way to survive the sadness and cruelty of one's tormentors. That I quote from Creative Suffering. Well, the legacy of Julius in her final testimonies. In a letter dated 6 April 1954, Julia discussed the acceptance of suffering as the most essential aspect of the Christian faith, often overlooked or contradicted by ambiguous liberal notions. In the same correspondence, she further asserted regarding the psychological and spiritual power of prayer. Julia's reflection encapsulates profound insight into the Christian faith. Her emphasis on the acceptance of suffering as a central tenet, despite its inexplicable nature, challenges conventional philosophical explanations. She magnifies the significance of Christ's crucifixion over his birth, highlighting the transformative power of this acceptance. Moreover, her discourse on prayer transcends the conventional understanding of petitions, illuminating a deeper, unifying force within the human psyche. This unitive understanding of petition show our interpretation of Christ's message about Calvary in its main resonances is the unity of spirit rather than mere physical presence. In essence, Julius' contemplation underscore a depth of spirituality that transcends traditional comprehension, urging a deeper reflection on the spiritual mysteries inherent in a Christian faith. Epilogue. In a note dated 29 March 1955, Julian encapsulates our perspective on suffering, delineating three distinct categories according to her that I show on the slide, the quotation. Julian the Bersault embodied what Christ was on the cross, responding with love to those who tortured her. Christian command to forgive, love enemies, bless those who persecute us, renews, transforms, and helps the world. The kingdom of God is built on the transformative power of forgiveness and acceptance. Finally, the story of Julia de Brissault teaches us that injustice is defeated with love and non-violence. In a world where forgiveness is severed from revenge and love suffocated by hatred, Julia's testimony shines as a beacon of hope. Julia's journey is a call to embrace the path of love and forgiveness, transforming the chains of hatred into an embrace of reconciliation. The rose blossom are symbols of hope and rebirth in the hearts of those who heeded Julia de Brissault's lesson. Love and forgiveness can overcome even the darkest storms, illuminating the path towards a renewed world, a kingdom of peace and justice, guided by the light of compassion and universal brotherhood. Reflecting on their intricate concept of suffering, as elucidated by Julia, provides a profound insight into human complexity. Our words prompts a broader contemplation of the nuance of this emotion, its nature, and the intricate connection between suffering and the quest for meaning in the human life. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia, for the presentation. If you give me a moment, we are reaching the end of our allotted time at 12:45. We do have a 15-minute break, so I certainly encourage anyone who'd like to stay for a little conversation to do so, but obviously if you'd like to take a break before the next panel. So I'll give everyone a few minutes, and I do know Jen Lindsay's here as well, so if we want to take a few minutes just to, any questions for Alicia, and then Jen, you're welcome to present. We'll have to run into the break time, but as I said, anybody who can stay, I encourage you to stay. And if you need to go, obviously we understand. So first, I'd like to open up the floor. You're welcome to unmute and ask questions or drop something in the chat, whichever you prefer. I see somebody beautiful. Thank you. Well, thank you, Barry. Anybody else? Okay. Let's see. I see Julia raising her hand. If you'd like to unmute and yeah.
Thank you very much for creative suffering presentation. I learned a lot. I wonder, so I hope as Christians, we don't have to wait until concentration camp to exercise so I think in contemporary society, one human condition that's against such exercises, maybe we live a way too comfortable life. So I wonder, what do you think about that? Like in our most immediate environment, like still we can exercise this. And then also, what do you think about the role of support in, I mean, your one of the points of the experiencing it is the communion of receiving communion. And then you said receiving communion with the saints is the source of strength or coping mechanism. Now I wonder, in our religious community, in our church community, what do you think about the role of support? I mean, besides, in addition to the saints from the past, that might be a helpful resource for coping suffering or nearing God, etc.
And thank you for the question, Alicia. If I can encourage a little brevity on this, just so we have time for Lindsay, maybe try to keep it under 2 minutes, and then we can jump into the next presentation. Thank you.
I can answer.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So this is so many occasions to exercise as to patience. Patience is the right word for this moment. I live in the whole Europe. The spirit of this moment is very, very bad. So in my home community, in the church, I'm a Catholic, Latin church, but it's the same. It's the same. We feel the climate of suffering. These are two words on the border in the Mediterranean area. The keywords that and the lesson who try by Julia is a message, a universal message. The experience is shareable with Julia in a different way, I know, but the suffering is the same in our heart. We should make audience like God, and we should see and feel the cross of Christ.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that answer. I wish we could discuss a little more, but I see that we have Jen Lindsay here. We will need to start our next panel at 1 o'clock, so we had some confusion, it looks like. So my apologies, Jen, we don't have a ton of time.
Excuse me, I forgot most part of this book from Julia. You find it in Kharkiv.org. Free.
Great, fantastic. Okay, good. So let's see if she's still here. I'd like to give the floor to, let's see, are you here? Melissa. Yeah, Jen, if you'd like to unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon. Hello. I'm so sorry. I was in the wrong breakout room and I didn't realize it. But here I found myself to the right place now. And it's great that I have 11 minutes because that's I don't even need much more than that. I wanted to, I've been asked to come here today and talk to you guys about a new movie that I made. My name, again, is Jen Lindsay. I'm a professor of sociology of religion at John Cabot University in Rome, Italy. I'm American, grew up in California, but I did my PhD at Boston University. I attended Union Theological for MDiv, and found my way to Rome in the social sciences department of John Cabot. So I'm also a documentary filmmaker. So a lot of the sociology that I practice is visual sociology and sort of finding a way for the field subjects of my research to actually represent themselves on screen. So there was a movie that I started making about 2015. I got a phone call in early 2015 from a professor at Boston University in the School of Theology and the Religious Studies Department. His name is Wesley J. Wildman. Some of you may know what Dr. Wildman. And Dr. Wildman, for those of you who don't know him, is a classic polymath. He's a concert pianist, a computer scientist, a world-class theologian, and a great leader of a research institute called the Center for Mind and Culture in Boston. And he asked me for a Zoom meeting. He knew that I had a background in documentary filmmaking and I'm a sociologist of religion. And he got in touch with me and he said, listen, we've just got a big grant from the John Templeton Foundation to pull together a bunch of cognitive scientists and computer programmers and religion scholars to try and build computer simulations and models and sort of AI models of how religion works in history. Very ambitious, very interesting combination of methodologies and subjects. Seemed quite impossible to everybody we described the project to. And the John Templeton Foundation was very smart. They said, we will give you this enormous amount of funding if you find a way to explain the project to the general public, because they had a strong sort of public involvement component. And I think John Templeton Foundation is very smart about that because they understand that academic research out of the ivory tower can sometimes be so specialized that the lay people out in the world can't necessarily follow cutting edge research. And Wesley had this epiphany that if he could enlist a documentary filmmaker to follow the project, then that would be a really good bridge to the world outside, beyond the ivory tower. And so he said to me in a Zoom call in 2015, hey, Jen, if I can find the money, do you think you could make a documentary film exploring the application of AI to our understanding of religious radicalization and violence? And I said, of course, on the call, I said, sure, I've already got some ideas. And the Zoom call ends and I'm Googling, what's AI and religion? What's computer simulation and modeling? I had no idea. But as an artist and a scholar, I have to pay my rent. So I say yes to everything and then figure it out later, right? So then I commenced this big journey. The project ran from 2015 to 2018 out of different cities. They worked out of the Virginia Modeling and Simulation Center in Suffolk, Virginia, out of Boston, the Center for Mind and Culture. And then there was one of the PIs of the project is based in Kristiansand, Norway. And then we also had a connection to do some of the field research in the refugee camps of Lesbos, Greece. So it took quite a few years to figure out how to present this group of scholars in an engaging story format, because we academics tend to do really boring things like wear khaki pants and type all day, which does not make for engaging storytelling. And also these professionals had an investment in like professional behavior. So I couldn't do like a reality show, super drama story. That would also been engaging for the wrong reasons. But I'm so happy to say that in this calendar year, we finally finished the movie. We got hung up in legal for a long time because there are some visual events and news footage in the movie, sort of trying to present the ambitions of this research project and the methodologies and the scientists in it. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to use the rest of my time to show you the trailer of the movie and some of the sample scenes, so you had a sense of what this film actually is. And are you guys able to see my screen?
I can see it fine. I imagine that means everybody else can.
Okay, great. So yes, this is the movie. It's called Simulating Religious Violence. This is the project page on Oopsie, the website of my production company, and I just managed to lose that page, and there it is, right there back. Okay, sorry, hold on. Zoom problems, like usual. Okay, here we are. So yeah, so the tagline of the movie is program it, predict it, prevent it. I know what you're thinking. How can you express anything about religion? Something so complicated as a social fact of our very complicated, constantly evolving, emerging social world. And how can you press that into computer code with any degree of precision or integrity? And these scientists were extremely sensitive to the skepticism of that an endeavor, and they also were really committed to building their models based on decades of social science research and theoretical frameworks. And so, the description of the film and the projects is that this crew of computer scientists and religion scholars embark on a 3-year project to apply computer simulation modeling to find solutions to worldwide humanitarian crises. It all started because the Boston Marathon bombing was right in the front yard of the Center for Mind and Culture in Boston. And then, their search took them all over the world into sort of different environments. So I would like to show you first the trailer, and then we'll have a little bit of time to watch part of the samples of the movie, but here we go. I'd like to confirm that you can hear the audio.
If the audio is sirens, I did hear that.
Great. No.
Religion can cultivate virtue, it can help give people the motivation for their norms, for the way in which they behave morally, but it can also, under certain conditions, lead to conflict between groups.
How could this have happened? How could this have been?
I felt, the day after the Boston bombing, that I needed to be doing more. I should be doing something about this.
I want to figure out how to take scholarly work out of the ivory tower into the real world. Wesley and I designed a project to build computer simulations of religion in order to understand it better.
This model has potentially predictive capacities to understand the future of conflicts. We can understand why people will bomb a marathon or bring down the buildings of the two towers.
What we're doing with the artificial intelligence to study religious violence and what we're doing to study the refugee crisis. That connection is human identity, how we identify as individuals.
How can we actually make a difference in real people's lives right now, not just by teaching them in the classroom, but by solving practical problems? I'm going to be able to look at myself in the mirror and think something other than you could have, but you didn't try. I'm not going to have that thought.
So that is the trailer, meant, of course, to entice people into watching it. I'll just take another 2 minutes or so to show you a few excerpts for the film.
And so we come together to pray and mourn and measure our loss. But we also come together today to reaffirm that the spirit of this city is undaunted, and the spirit of this country shall remain undimmed.
I actually was living in Oxford at the time, and I was having a dinner party that night and had a bunch of my friends over for the evening. I kept hearing my phone go off. It was ding, 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 ding. It was so annoying, and I didn't really want to bother myself as to why my phone was going crazy. I, went and checked my phone to see what all the sort of sounds were about. There had been a bombing in Boston during the marathon, and it gave me sort of a sense of helplessness. I felt, the day after the Boston bombing, that I needed to be doing more. I should be doing something about this. This is what I do. My contribution to the academic literature should not just be for the sake of pure knowledge. We can understand why people will bomb a marathon or bring down the buildings of the two towers or shoot up a nightclub in Paris or drive a truck into a Christmas market in Germany. And as someone who does modeling of religion, I can help to answer these questions so that we can better prevent these things from happening in the future.
Modeling in simulation is used all the time for everything. It's used to create new cars, it's used to handle flight simulators, it's used to build distribution routes, it's used to manage the economy, it's used for everything that affects you in your daily life.
This model has potentially predictive capacities to understand the future of conflicts, because what we're looking at are the causal mechanisms behind religious and ethnic conflict. If you
I'll just show a little bit of the part where they go into the refugee camps in Greece.
Skin to skin.
I mean, not only is there a gigantic, immense mound of life jackets, torn, ripped, some okay, a lot of them torn up. Some of them were faked life jackets, like they put grass in them to make them look as if they were life jackets, but they really weren't.
I mean, the scale of it is hard to grasp.
Yeah.
So I'm 6'2", and I'm looking like dead in the middle of that pile. So I mean, they have to be piled at least 12, 13 feet high here, and that's a smaller pile.
So now it's the end of the summer, it's August, and we're in.
Okay, I'll go ahead and stop that for now. But if you are interested in finding out more about this film, you can go to the Sofari Films webpage. And I'm happy to say that this film will soon be available for showing in classrooms, to have your university library order it to get into the catalog. So you can always talk to me about that if you're interested. So there's a lot more to say about this film. Obviously, I only got a few minutes now here, but it is a really, I think, a very, engaging story about the complexity of the religious world, about how people become fused to causes in their deepest self-concept and their identity center, to the extent that they will take as a personal affront any larger threat to their group that may be experienced in the media, to the extent that they'd be willing to take violent action in order to counter what they perceive to be a personal threat. So this is sort of like one of the sort of overarching theoretical frameworks that the scientists are testing in the movie to better understand why people become vulnerable to radicalization, and what are the factors that might increase people's vulnerability to radicalization, and to explore the very sensitive question of what is the relationship between refugee asylum seeking populations and religious violence, because they're often running away from an outbreak of religious violence, and the refugees and asylum seekers statistically themselves do not tend to commit acts of religious violence, but the second generation, their sons and daughters, who are then growing up in hostile host countries, stuck in ethnic enclaves, isolated, often watching hostile media messages about their own group emerging from political rhetoric within their host countries. Those are the groups that are increasingly vulnerable to radicalization. So the film explores those parallels and the challenges to integration that have been demonstrated to increase vulnerability to radicalization. So if you want to know more, you can drop me a line. We're also looking for scholars to review the film right now. So if you want to watch a pre-screening, pre-release copy in exchange for a short 100-word review, I'd be very, very honored to share it with you. And I'm leaving my email address there in the chat if you want to know more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. This looks
thank you.
fascinating. Maybe we could even do an ISIC screening eventually.
That would be awesome.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time. I know once again we went over into the break. So for those who stuck around, thank you for that. For the next panel, I know William is in the room. I believe you are going to be moderating, if I'm not mistaken.